Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. Today, we are discussing the digital colonialism and democratic opportunity in Africa. This is the third virtual session, part of the Africa Drive for Democracy, being held since 21st of August. We have 4 sessions. The last session will be held on 4th of November at the same time. I will kindly ask those who are not speaking, if they have access to their mics, to mute them. And just to indicate that interpretation is available in English and French. If you click, there's a globe written with interpretation written on the side. You can click on it and choose English, if English, you want to listen in English, and choose French if you want the French interpretation. Donc, nous avons, il y a une interprétation qui est disponible. Donc, cliquez sur le globe interprétation et choisissez la langue française pour pouvoir écouter tout le webinaire en français. Thank you for that. So today's topic actually is digital colonialism and democratic opportunity in Africa. On one hand, digital platforms allow more people to access information and engage in civic life. On the other hand, large global tech companies use African data for profit, often without any accountability. This creates a risk of digital colonialism, where foreign companies control the digital space in ways that limit Africa's own power over its data and privacy. This panel will discuss how African nations and civil society can respond, protect digital rights, and use digital tools to support an independent and fair digital future for everyone. I will now give the opportunity to our main speakers, and who will each have 2 minutes to give an introductory statement on the topic. And I will begin with Ashna Kalemera, who is the program manager at CIPESA. Ashna, you have the floor.
Thank you, Aisha. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where each of our attendees are joining us from. My name is Ashna Kalemera. I work as the programs manager at CIPESA. CIPESA is the collaboration on international ICT policy for East and Southern Africa. Our work is focused on policy and practice of tech as it intersects with society, with governance, with the economy, and with human rights. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and thank you so much to the organizers for extending an invitation to CIPESA to take part in this very important dialogue. In terms of opening remarks, I'll say that historically, discussions around tech and digitalization in Africa have focused on access and infrastructure, with efforts geared towards ensuring that state and non-state actors' interventions focused on extending connectivity and getting more and more citizens on the continent online. As we're gaining momentum in this regard, i.e. connectivity and more citizens being online, it's very important that priorities must be broadened beyond the access and connectivity priorities that are historic. But to ensure that as more and more come online, the users, the citizens from the continent are doing so in meaningful ways, with technology being a key pillar of society, with technology being a key pillar of the economy, with technology being a key pillar of democracy. And that is to say that it's giving voice to everyone. It is leaving no one behind. It's promoting innovation and contributing to socio-economic and political development. So discourse such as this that broaden that lens are absolutely critical. So excited to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ashna. Now I'll give the floor to Mike Muchiri, who is an activist based in Kenya. Mike, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. You can hear me, yeah?
Yes, we can.
My name is Mike Mushiri. I am a Kenyan activist, but I'm mostly a digital content creator. I make content on my socials. I'm also the founder of an organization called Civic Rise. And through Civic Rise, so basically what Civic Rise we do, we package laws and policies, Kenyan laws and policies, into formats that are easily understood and easily accessible to local Kenyans. Um, because that's the core value and the core principle of civic rights, to decapitate discrimination when it comes to understanding laws and policies that are put in place, laws, policies, and bills that are put in place by the government. I also run an organization for creators called Creatorize, to support content creators and any form of creators. And I am so glad and I'm super thankful to be part of this conversation. And I like the fact that it's called the digital colonialism, because that's exactly what it is. And over the past few months, I would say that as a Kenyan, and I speak on behalf of so many Kenyans, we really have experienced what we are calling digital colonialism. So I am looking forward to the conversation and contributing my thoughts on it. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. And now I'll give the floor to Mamadou Diagne, who is one of the pioneers of internet in Senegal, but also is a data scientist with Africtivist. He'll be speaking in French, so you can go to the interpretation button and switch to English to be able to hear what he's saying. Thank you. Mamadou?
Merci Aïcha, ravi d'être là, de pouvoir partager cet espace d'échange, de dialogue sur une problématique qui nous tient à cœur à Africtivist. Moi, c'est Mamadou Diagne, sénégalais, membre d'Africtivist, data scientist. Donc, comme vous le savez, l'Afrique est aujourd'hui au milieu de tout ce bouleversement qui est en train de se dérouler dans le monde. C'est-à-dire que le nombre d'Africains qui aujourd'hui utilisent ces outils, aussi bien pour les besoins de s'exprimer, d'échanger, mais de démocratie et de bonne gouvernance, ces outils, comme vous le savez tous, sont aujourd'hui des outils qu'on ne peut pas se passer. Mais si vous savez ce qui se passe au quotidien, vos données sont exploitées d'une manière qui ne vous rend pas souvent service. Aujourd'hui, on a beaucoup d'innovations technologiques grâce aux sciences des données. Ces sciences de données sont superbes parce qu'elles permettent des innovations comme l'intelligence artificielle. Mais la contrepartie à payer, c'est qu'une bonne partie de nos données sont collectées pour permettre cette innovation. Comment rendre cet univers space, ce cyberspace beaucoup plus safe, beaucoup plus sûr pour nous tous, et que nous aussi, Africains, qui sommes souvent laissés en dehors de ces gros groupes, ces grosses entreprises, ces GAFA, qu'on ait aussi notre voix et qu'on ait aussi un contrôle sur nos données, c'est des pistes de réflexion qu'on est amené à réfléchir et à apporter des solutions. Je pense que la science des données, elle est là pour tous, aussi bien africains, européens, mais nous, on est impliqués ou on est engagés en tant qu'Africains à mieux comprendre ces données, à mieux comprendre comment elles sont collectées, comment elles sont analysées, pour que demain, on ne soit pas impacté par des choses qu'on n'aurait pas prévues. Donc, je suis encore ravi d'être là et vous remercie pour cette invitation.
Merci beaucoup, Géno. On a un petit souci technique que Aziza va essayer de régler avec l'interprète. On n'a pas, il paraît que en fait, les anglophones n'ont pas entendu ce que tu as dit n'a pas été interprété en anglais. Donc, je vais laisser la main à Aziza pour qu'elle gère de côté ce souci-là avec l'interprétation avant qu'on ne revienne vers toi, Geno, dans quelques instants. So we have a minor technical issue in terms of interpretation from French to English. So Aziza will handle that with the interpreter while we begin the questions. Aziza, please help with that to make sure that the interpreter also interprets from French to English to facilitate the conversation. Thank you so much, Aziza, for helping with that. Nous allons, no. Well, that's the issue when speaking many languages. So now we'll continue in English. I have a question, and I'll start with Ashna. In my introduction, I spoke about the risk of digital colonialism. Mike talked about the fact that that digital colonialism is a fact, and Mamadou Diagne also, through what he said the same thing. But I will ask this question: is Africa facing digital colonialism? So, Ashna, if you can briefly respond to that, so we are clear if this is just a risk or thoughts, or if it's a fact.
Thanks, Aisha. I think there are a couple of characteristics of colonialisms that we must put forward first before responding to that question. And I'll point to two of those characteristics. The first is inequality, and the second is an imbalance of power. Based on those two characteristics of colonialism, we see those same manifestations within Africa's digital ecosystems. I'll give just a few examples. There are a myriad of them, but I'll point to three. The first one is disparity in users. And what I mean here is penetration rates in Africa, technology penetration rates in Africa compared to other parts of the world. The 2024 ITU Development Index scores Africa 50.3, which is far below the scores of Europe, Asia, Africa, and Americas, who score above 70. So that disparity in access and penetration is a characteristic of what we're defining as digital colonialism. The second example of the characteristics of digital colonialism are that those same users that I've described were quite limited on the continent, approximately a quarter of the over 1 billion citizens, are mostly consumers of the tech, as opposed to being producers within the ecosystem. All applications, be it social media, be it public service platforms, in some cases, are platforms that are developed in the global north or away from the African continent. That's a second characteristic of the inequality and power imbalance within the ecosystem on the continent. The third point is that frameworks that are governing this very same digital ecosystem are frameworks that are developed outside of African contexts. These normative frameworks are obviously very critical in terms of upholding human rights or ensuring equity and diversity, but unfortunately, they are being developed outside of the African continent. Such, they're perpetuating bias and discrimination. We'll use the example of something quite relatable, and a buzzword these days is around AI. So frameworks around AI are mostly being generated away from the continent. 2 years ago, CIPESA conducted a study on the implications of AI, automated decision-making, and how those affect social injustice on the continent. And an example from the findings of those studies revealed that an African male who was working in the UK was facing financial exclusion due to his ethnicity, of course, his gender, and his address in a migrant community where he lived. As a result, he faced higher insurance premiums and limited access to bank loans. That's just one example. Another day-to-day example is voice command recognition of non-European or American accents by virtual assistants or other command-based technologies. So the ability of those command-based technologies to recognize my accent as a speaker of English as a second language or a non-native English speaker. And that again perpetuates the bias and discrimination, which is a characteristic of colonialism.
Thank you, Ashna. So how can, or what strategies can policymakers implement? One, to ensure accountability, and two, to protect users from exploitation?
Excellent question, Aisha. Once we have the answer for it, I'm sure the world will be a much happier place. So whereas the question is skewed towards policymakers, I honestly believe that we all have a different role to play in terms of pushing for accountability and protecting users of various digital technologies on the continent. So bearing that in mind, that there are different stakeholders and we can all play a role, I think some of the strategies need to ensure that they are complementary and reinforcing each stakeholder expertise. One such way is continued research and documentation of the various developments or how the lay of the land is shaping up on the continent in terms of internet access and use of technology. This research is very important in terms of informing not only the work of policymakers, but also other actors that are involved in advocacy and engagement with platforms to push for more accountability and transparency in development and governance of these tech platforms. The second strategy is on building a cohort of actors, both state and non-state, that can collaborate around these issues. We very often see stakeholders working in silos. So policymakers are very busy making laws. Academia is very busy churning out research papers. Innovators are continuing to code, all of them in isolation. So it's very important that actors come together and work in meaningful ways to ensure that the power imbalances and the inequality which characterizes colonialization is overcome. Another opportunity for pushing for more transparency around digitalization on the continent is ensuring that there are more opportunities for stakeholder deliberation, learning and exchange on these issues, precisely what this platform is for. Having such dialogue enables more nuanced understanding of what the issues are, especially when those platforms provide not only for policymakers' presence, but also civil society actors' presence, journalists' presence, civil society's presence. Ultimately, with all those utopian thinking in one place, there has to be a conducive and progressive policy and legislative environment. How that comes about, again, is the stuff of dreams and legends, but there are a few pointers on how we can go about that. One is ensuring that any legislation or policy making is consultative and inclusive. Obviously, that's a role very directly related to policymakers. So provide spaces for dialogue and engagement on proposed laws and amendments and bills, so that whatever law is put on the books, it's in tandem with developments and has incorporated input and feedback from various stakeholders. Of course, the platforms themselves or the tech giants also have a role to play. And this calls for more engagement with users on the continent, as well as the policymakers themselves, not only to raise awareness and understanding of what some of these issues are, but also to make them more visible and alive on the continent. We don't see that as much in Africa as compared to Europe. A recent example is where the South African Parliament, not too long ago, summoned platforms on data privacy issues in South Africa, and only one platform showed up. I will say that again, only one platform showed up when the South African Parliament issued those summons. We can't say that the situation is the same in other jurisdictions, because we see a lot of top executives appearing before policymakers in the United States, which shows a commitment to the cause in terms of ensuring that tech is being rolled out in an equitable way in those jurisdictions. So more efforts of such engagement on the continent would definitely go a long way in pushing for transparency and ensuring that user rights are protected.
Thank you, Ashna. Yeah, there's a lot that needs to be done, and we should have all hands on deck. I will go to Mamadou, and I would ask Mamadou actually, how is data, how is user data being monetized by tech companies, and what role does data scientists, for instance, or data science play in either facilitating or challenging this process?
Merci Aïcha pour la question. Donc, aujourd'hui, pour faire simple, un utilisateur qui va sur Internet utilise soit des services, soit des plateformes. Sur ces plateformes, avant d'y entrer, on a une politique de confidentialité qui est partagée et que les utilisateurs acceptent de partager en utilisant ces plateformes ou ces services, de partager leurs données. Les données souvent que les utilisateurs partagent, c'est les données personnelles, à commencer les noms, les prénoms, les adresses e-mail, et j'en passe. Mais ça ne s'arrête pas là. Toutes les activités que nous faisons sont collectées. Pour les data scientists, cette richesse ou cette mine d'or qui sont les données, qui sont collectées au fil des années sur vos activités, sur ce que vous regardez, sur ce que vous aimez sur Facebook, c'est aujourd'hui, vu la puissance de calcul des ordinateurs, ça nous permet de prédire vos comportements. Ça veut dire que très souvent, vous voyez qu'un utilisateur qui a l'habitude de faire certaines choses, quand on regarde ces choses, on peut prédire demain qu'est-ce que cet utilisateur voudra regarder, voudra lire, voudra apporter, etc. Donc, le modèle économique de Facebook et beaucoup d'autres plateformes qui sont en ligne, elle est très simple. En premier, c'est de vous donner de la publicité qui est personnalisée sur le contenu que vous regardez. Donc, cette publicité génère beaucoup de revenus pour des entreprises telles que Facebook, Google, etc. Donc, ce travail aujourd'hui est possible grâce au travail des data scientists. Imaginez que même si vous ne voulez pas divulguer votre identité, on peut reconstituer des pièces d'un puzzle et savoir qui se cache derrière cette identité. Parce que l'autre réalité aussi, en dehors d'aller sur des plateformes, c'est que quand vous utilisez votre téléphone portable de nos jours, on vous collecte ces données à votre insu et que vous n'y pouvez rien. Les téléphones regardent votre parcours, les téléphones regardent sur quoi vous surfez. Et mieux, il y a certaines applications qui vous enregistrent à votre insu. Quand on a la voix de chez vous, de l'enfant, on peut donner un modèle de données qui va très vite comprendre qu'est-ce que vous êtes en train de dire et ensuite stocker des informations utiles sur vous. Donc, ce travail encore est possible parce que l'Internet est un formidable outil. Les puissances de calcul sur les serveurs comme Amazon, Google sont aujourd'hui des denrées qui sont à portée de tous. Mais la matière première de tout ce travail, c'est vos données. Donc, ces données sont là et un data scientist, il va jouer dessus et il va créer à ces entreprises de gagner de l'argent. L'autre question, Aïcha, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, oui, en fait, ce que je disais, c'est que comment est-ce qu'on peut, à travers des... sorry, I'll speak in English. What ethical practice should be adopted to avoid contributing to digital colonialism?
Merci Aïcha.
Oui, en fait, ma question, c'est quelles pratiques éthiques devraient être adoptées pour éviter de contribuer au colonialisme digital? I will kindly ask English
Merci.
speakers
Donc
to click
le
on.
colonialisme est là. Je pense que si on remonte l'histoire et qu'on
Géno, on
se
a du mal à t'entendre.
dit que
On a du mal.
quand les
Géno,
colons
Géno.
venaient en
Mamadou,
Afrique,
Mamadou,
ils
we have
venaient chercher
difficulties here. On
la
a du
ressource première, du café, du cacao, etc. Donc, oui, allô? Est-ce que vous me recevez? C'est bon là? Est-ce que vous me recevez?
Non, attends, Géno, Géno.
Oui,
Oui, on t'entend pas, ça se coupe. Est-ce que tu peux éteindre ta caméra? Peut-être ça va améliorer la connexion.
c'est bon. Je viens d'éteindre la caméra.
Oui, attends,
C'est
avant de
beaucoup mieux?
répondre. Oui, ça va, c'est beaucoup mieux. Avant de répondre, English speakers, instead of being on the main audio, please click on the interpretation globe and choose English so that you would have the content continuously in English. If you click on the main audio, when someone is speaking in French, you will hear directly in French. Thank you. Vas-y, Mamadou. Take it on.
Merci. Oui, je vous entends. D'accord. Merci. Je vais m'efforcer. Merci encore. Donc, ce que je disais, le colonialisme ou le colon, euh, quand il arrive en Afrique, il était venu chercher des ressources. Ces ressources, ça veut dire que quand il les prend, il repart, il ne fait, les habitants ne tiraient pas grand profit de ces ressources. Aujourd'hui, comme vous le savez tous, les ressources, c'est vos données. Donc, s'il y a des bonnes pratiques pour éviter que le colon puisse exploiter vos données à votre insu, la première des choses qu'on devrait apprendre, nous, data scientists, aux utilisateurs lambda, c'est leur dire comment leurs données sont collectées. C'est des informations que les entreprises doivent rendre publiques. Et ces dernières années, beaucoup de législations dans les pays européens, américains, poussent les grandes entreprises à divulguer les données qui sont collectées chez les utilisateurs et en plus de divulguer ces données qui sont collectées et de dire par quels moyens ces données sont collectées. Si les utilisateurs déjà sont informés des moyens utilisés pour collecter leurs données, ils peuvent le savoir et commencer à savoir quelles démarches doivent-ils adopter pour éviter cela. Ce n'est pas suffisant d'être informé. L'autre approche, elle est plutôt technique. Ça veut dire aujourd'hui utiliser des technologies ou des avancées de la technologie pour que quand vos données vont être utilisées par X ou Y personnes ou vont être redonnées à d'autres, que vous soyez informés et que vous ayez la possibilité, si vous le désirez ou pas, de les partager ou non. Donc, il y a beaucoup de démarches techniques qui sont actuellement à la portée des utilisateurs. Elles ne sont pas une convention internationale, je pourrais le dire comme ça. D'où les citer ici, peut-être n'aideront pas certains, mais je vais en citer une par exemple. Une des technologies la plus avancée, c'est l'approche d'utiliser le Web 3. Quand on parle de Web 3, très souvent, on parle de blockchain. Ça veut dire, imaginez que vos données vous avez le contrôle de vos données. Mais comment avoir ce contrôle? C'est sur une blockchain. Cette blockchain, elle va crypter vos données. D'autres personnes pourront la voir, mais ne pourront pas y accéder. À chaque fois qu'une personne ou une application ou un service demandera l'accès à vos données, à vous d'autoriser par votre identité virtuelle cet accès ou pas. C'est une démarche parmi tant d'autres. Mais le plus important pour qu'on en arrive à des technologies vulgarisées et que tout le monde utilise, c'est de commencer par faire des plaidoyers sur le sujet. L'importance, surtout pour nous Africains, d'avoir beaucoup plus de contrôle sur cette collecte de données. Si vous le savez, je vais citer en Union européenne, nous avons la loi qui permet de réglementer la protection des données personnelles. Elle s'appelle RGPD, Règlement général sur la protection des données personnelles. Cette législation qui marche dans l'Union européenne a contraint beaucoup de GAFA et beaucoup d'entreprises à respecter davantage les données personnelles des utilisateurs. Nous pourrons en reparler, mais pour revenir sur le sujet, en Afrique, rien ne sert de créer de nouvelles démarches. À nous de nous inspirer de choses qui marchent déjà, comme j'ai cité. Certaines pistes sont technologiques, d'autres pistes sont législatives ou sont l'utilisation de lois et de règlements qui contraignent les entreprises à aller dans une certaine démarche. Et pour ce, je pourrais citer même au Nigeria, Meta a été une amende, si je me rappelle bien, je pense, je ne sais pas, 1,2 milliard d'euros à peu près, parce que Meta faisait une collecte illégale de données et que l'État nigérien a contraint Meta à ne pas faire cela et en plus à payer une amende. Donc, à nous juste de nous inspirer de toutes ces choses et comme l'a dit tout à l'heure Hassana, de trouver un plaidoyer qui est commun à tous les Africains pour aller vers de l'avant. Merci.
Merci. Thank you, Mamoudou. Those are very, very important points and actionable points that can be used. Now I will go to Mike, and after speaking to Mike, we will open the floor to the first questions. We already have two, and I will ask participants, you have the possibility of writing your questions directly in the Q&A icon button you see below. So kindly do so as well. So Mike, as an activist, how do you perceive the impact of digital colonialism on grassroots movements in Africa?
Thank you for that question. Everyone can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
You can see me as well?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I really loved what Ashna contributed to the conversation, and she talked about power imbalance. And I was thinking the way there is a direct correlation between power imbalance and digital colonialism, and not just digital colonialism, but any form of colonialism. Because currently, the colonialism, it's now a conversation about digital colonialism, but there's also colonialism in other spaces like the healthcare. Currently, there's an organization called the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. I'm forming a foundation to answer the question. I'm forming a foundation with this. So this organization is pushing for something we're calling a pandemic agreement. And a pandemic agreement came by after most African governments collectively coming together, coming to a realization that if another pandemic was to hit Africa, Africa would entirely be at the mercy of the global north in terms of accessibility to vaccines. And that's also, however you choose to understand it, however you choose to comprehend that whole thing, that's also a form of colonialism, but now in a different space. And today we are talking about digital colonialism. And I love the fact that I'm supposed to speak about the impact that digital colonialism has on digital civil society and African activism. And I will say that digital activism has a direct impact on grassroots movements. For example, in Kenya, activism is in two forms. We have on-ground activism and we have digital activism, which is mostly the kind of activism that's being witnessed in Kenya. And over the past few months, especially at the beginning of June, at the end of May, beginning of June, July, August, while there were protests in Kenya concerning the 2024 finance bill, the activism that was happening then was mostly digital. And this can create vulnerabilities for the movement, because it makes the movement an easy target to be killed. It makes it an easy target to kill. And that's the thing that we saw back in June during the protest. There was control over data, there was control over the digital infrastructure, there was also control over the communication channels in regard to the protests that were going on in Kenya. I'm not going to say by who, but we all know by who. And this, to some extent, not even to some extent, to the extreme extent, this limited the movement in a way. The movement was really successful in its form, but we did not get to accomplish what exactly we wanted, because there was also limiting the digital limiting by the body that was limiting it in any form. And speaking on a global perspective, this kind of control on these digital platforms, they limit African nations and communities' autonomy, and they limit the kind of activism that's going on in a specific community or a specific nation. So the regulation, you see, mostly in Africa and especially in Kenya, and I'm speaking on behalf of Kenya because I'm Kenyan, the activism that's here is mostly digital. So when there is a lot of regulation of this digital platform, when there's a lot of regulation and not the good kind of regulation, a regulation to impede the protests, or a regulation to see that the protest or the activism will be killed or is coming to an end, this form of regulation or this form of control often limits the activism, and it limits where certain grassroots movements head to in their foreseeable future. Yeah, so I think that's what I can say regarding that question.
Yeah, a follow-up question, actually. What are the steps that can be taken to be able to make sure that, there is no external or internal influence that will impact the activism at local level here, for instance, within Kenya?
I do think there are some proactive strategies that Kenyans and other African nations can use to reclaim the digital autonomy and strengthen the local activism. And number one, for example, during the protest in Kenya, I love the fact that even after our digital communication channels were interrupted with, we still found ways to show up on the streets. We still found ways to fuel the movement and to really get the message out there that this is exactly what we want. This is our communication. This is our message to the government. This is our message to a certain political figure. And the message could eventually get to them. For example, lawyers came together to help the movement, not just digitally, but also on ground. When peaceful protesters were arrested unlawfully, lawyers were coming from all over the nation to really bail the activists and the protesters out. We saw doctors coming together. We saw the tech community use other forms, use other tools to fuel the movement, not just using the digital platforms, the social platforms, but they also used other platforms and other tools to disseminate information about the movement, to disseminate information concerning the constitution, the finance bill, and other laws and policies. So I think there is need for Africans, there is need for African nations to invest in homegrown tech solutions and digital policies that support sovereignty and power, especially when it comes to regulation of this, when it comes to, and Ashna was talking about how these global tech giants have control over data and the digital infrastructure that's in Kenya, not in Kenya, that's in Africa. And that's where the power imbalance comes in. So, and in regards to that, I think there is need for African nations to adopt digital policies. I want to say digital sovereignty policies that regulate how these foreign tech companies operate locally. And this is basically to protect us as Africans, to protect our rights, and to protect activists, to come up with policies that could include requirements for data localization, transparency, respect for local privacy laws. And we can also have lawyers and advocates lobby the governments to ensure that these policies protect African interests and uphold the freedom of expressions by Africans and by activists. Those are just some of the few steps I think we can inculcate to curb digital colonialism. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. Yes, it does. And from what Ashna said, what you said, and what Mamudu said, I think we are already building the future we want actually for the continent. I will open the floor to questions. We will begin with Ja Aroni. Please, we will have another set of Q&A at the end. So this is the first one. Be brief and straight to the point when asking your question. So Aziza, if you can open Ja Aroni's mic. After that, we have Winnie Kamau, who will be the second one. And then we have Stefan, who has already written his question in the Q&A. And yeah, those are the three we will take. Then we will go back to the panelists for to respond. Jai.
Good afternoon, Aisha. How are you today? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Jay. You have the floor.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor. Well, basically, I just wanted to highlight basically that this is an incredible discussion, especially in the context of what has been going on regionally. I think Mike covered it really well, especially within the Kenyan context, in terms of the challenges faced, especially during the Maandamano, or rather the protest period, which we've simply come to refer to as the Maandamano period, whereby it was a first for the entire country, and a lot of the mobilization came from the digital front in that regard. In the sense, I mean, Mike covered it well. It was both digital mobilization and physical mobilization. However, a major part of it came from the digital sphere. Although it posed its own unique set of challenges, such as, internet throttling, interference from services here and there, state agencies as well, not to mention abductions and kidnappings that came by way of people being tracked through the use of their IP addresses and so on. So it really, as much as it opened up avenues for mobilizations for Kenyans across the nation, not just in central localized areas such as the capital city or other major cities. People in places as far as Narok, Baringo, even though they could not physically be there in the capital, they were able to contribute and participate through the online space and the digital sphere. And one of the biggest critics, I suppose, of this particular, digital mobilization was actually one of the economic advisors to the current incumbent president, who was very critical and vocal and said we would never go anywhere and we were never going to achieve anything. Pardon my French, but to quote exactly what he said, he called us digital wankers who will never achieve anything through this particular means. However, despite his language and what he said, I think we've all come to see the power of of digital advocacy for starters, and the power it brings in terms of mobilization across the nation. And we've also seen it spread. We've seen this happen in other African countries as well. There's been numerous discussions ongoing in places such as Uganda. We've seen our Nigerian counterparts talk about how people were able to use the online space and mobilize throughout different discussions. And so I think having webinars such as this, summit such as this, and covering topic such as this is extremely important. One, to highlight where we are, how far we've come, where we're going, and what our goals are. And it is a brilliant tool and platform in terms of learning from one another as far as sharing resources and gleaning insights from one another goes. So as far as my contribution goes, it's honestly to say thank you to everybody who's been part of this panel and everybody who's contributed. I don't think I could say or add anything further than what's already been said, because you've all covered it so beautifully and so succinctly. And I am simply grateful that we get to have this discussion, especially as someone who's lived and grown up on this continent and wants to continue to live and grow up here and to do his part as far as democracy goes. So thank you, Aisha, and thank you to everybody. I'll hand over the mic back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jay. Indeed, we have an amazing panel with us. And next is Winnie Kamau. You have the floor to ask your question. Then we have Stefan.
Okay, hi everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Winnie Kamal here from Association of Freelance Journalists and also a data journalist and an advocate of open data and artificial intelligence. And one thing that's coming out is that true, the topic is on point in terms of digital colonization, but also just looking at the fact that, yes, we are mobilizing, we are able, just following up from the earlier speaker, we are mobilizing digitally, but at the same time, my really big concern is that even as Africa is doing this, we're not putting money where our mouth is. That is, we have the population to be able to access all these digital platforms. But in terms of developing these platforms, we are not putting enough money, as in African money, into these platforms. And right now, in the age of AI, it's going to be worse, because the more we don't come out more effectively or just putting the money into the AI space, we're going to be colonized more, and we're going to be, we'll be the food at the table being served every day, because we have the numbers. And yes, we can be able to use the digital spaces. But in terms of developing these spaces, we need to really up our game as Africans. I know there are developers that are there, but we really need to up our game, especially when it comes now to the issues of AI and and the intersection between AI and democracy. It's gonna be another level of dominance. Thanks, Mike, for your candid presentation about the issues in Kenya. Yes, we need, I guess for me, it's not, okay, it's a question, but also again, it's a concern, a big concern, if we can be able to, do you think we have the potential to put our monies into developing this digital space so that we do not become the food at the table? Yes.
Thank you. And we will have the last question from Stefan Muti. I've seen Raymond's contribution in the Q&A. I will read it afterwards. Stefan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Aisha. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you very much. My name is Stephen Mutia. And I'm actually following up from what I have heard. And my question concerns the compromise that engaging the digital space can actually cause the African nations. And these concerns I saw that when we were really engaging our government in June, July, protest. We shared a lot of information online, and that is things to do with cultural artifacts. You know, we use songs that are very contextual and that have different meanings in our context here. The question is how, when we know all this colonialism that is ongoing, and actually even the issues of data in this country, the problem that we have in issues of data, how can we use our digital platforms without compromising our collective memory as Kenyans, as Africans, our identities, our heritage, security, and knowledge systems? Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. I will read Raymond's contribution, then I will let the panelists respond to the questions. Raymond Baseka is saying, I quote, "We have been allowed to use Zoom and are still coining a term, digital colonialism. I think the problem is with the African spirit. We are weak. We need to get stronger and push through barriers no matter the bottlenecks. Bottlenecks like digital colonialism cannot be our focus. We need to build Africa with our bare hands. We need to talk less and do more, and we are doing the reverse." Thank you, Raymond, for your contribution. I think holding this kind of discussion is also part of doing what's needed, because the partners, the organizations that are partners, or those that are invited, our panelists, are already working on these issues. Maybe it's not at the scale that we would expect, but at least we are starting somewhere, and we hope that we'll be able to reach that goal and be able to, address the issue you have raised. So I'll give the floor to Mike, Ashna, and Momodu to react to the two questions that have been asked. Over.
Si je peux me lancer, Aïcha.
Oui, vas-y, Momodu.
Merci encore. Je pense que c'est Raymond. Donc, il a parfaitement raison. Hein. Je pense que, vu de son point de vue, on est en train d'utiliser des outils du colonisateur au lieu d'utiliser, par exemple, nos propres outils. C'est tout à fait possible que nous, Africains, développions nos propres outils et nous disons, restons sur nos outils et n'allons pas sur les outils des autres. Et peut-être que si même nos outils vont être meilleurs que ceux des autres, on pourra les inviter à venir utiliser nos outils. Vu comme ça pourrait être simpliste et ça pourrait être super. En tant que militant de l'open source, je suis d'accord avec vous. Mais la problématique, elle est beaucoup plus complexe. C'est-à-dire qu'aujourd'hui, des outils africains, il y en a. Il y en a beaucoup. Des outils open source, il y en a. Des outils alternatifs, il y en a. Si on parle d'intelligence artificielle, il y a des alternatives qui sont open source. Mais la contrainte ou la difficulté majeure, c'est comme quand on dit consommons local. Elle est d'autant plus un problème culturel qu'un problème d'innovation, de compétences. Ça veut dire que je vous rejoins, nous devons tacler le problème, mais on peut le tacler d'une manière où on va tacler notre mentalité. Ça veut dire que c'est là où le mot ou le bas blesse. Vous l'avez dit, hein, notre mentalité n'est pas faible. Si vous dites que notre mentalité est weak, je dirais non, notre mentalité n'est pas faible. Mais comme le colonisateur nous a colonisé des années bien avant, il nous a amené l'école, nous a amené une certaine manière de penser, effectivement, ça peut rendre certains weak, mais d'autres, comme affectivistes, comme toutes ces personnes qui sont présentes là, sont dans cette piste de comment changer notre mentalité pour aller au-delà de ce mode de pensée. Et ne vous en faites pas si vous n'avez pas d'idée de quel outil utiliser pour faire du Skype, du Zoom ou d'autres choses. On va vous en proposer des outils. Mais le travail majeur, c'est le travail de sensibiliser. Le travail majeur, c'est le travail de faire switcher le mindset et de motiver davantage d'Africains à comprendre déjà la problématique et ensuite à leur présenter, après qu'ils aient compris la problématique, des solutions alternatives, à les accompagner, à les personnaliser suivant leur langue, suivant leur culture et les accompagner progressivement. Face à ce travail, on ne fait pas point face à des millions de dollars de grosses boîtes, mais on va y croire, on va se dire qu'ensemble, on peut y arriver. Merci encore.
Merci, merci Geno. Mike? Oh, Ashna?
Thanks, Aisha. I think the reactions and comments from the floor are great. I like to put a positive spin on things, in as much as the situation with quite dire. Apologies, I seem to be hearing the interpreter. Okay, yes, so I was saying that the reactions from the floor are great, in as much as the situation we're describing here is quite dire. There's quite a bit in terms of positive elements. Mike and Aroni pointed that out quite well, using the example of Kenya and how the various tech platforms have been able to give voice and enable mobilization and civic engagement to levels that were unheard of before. We must not forget that the African context that we're describing is very democracy deficit in the first place before we bring in the digital colonialism. The authoritarianism is growing on the continent, and tech is one of the ways in which we as citizens, as youth, and as stakeholders are able to push back on this growing power imbalance between the states and the citizens. So I think we must stay positive in that regard, that these very same colonial technologies we're describing are actually presenting opportunities that are no longer possible in the offline space. That said, another positive that I'd like to emphasize is, again, the mobilization and galvanizing of efforts, as Mike and Aroni also pointed out. Seeing the case as happened in Kenya, where lawyers were able to support strategic litigation for activists, seeing the medics and all these otherwise non-digital stakeholders becoming communities and providing support to activists is also something we must remain very alive to. Similarly, Stefan pointed to loss of identity and heritage. I'd like to spin that a bit and highlight the lack of local content in the digital space as it is already. So the fact that content, whether it was songs or cultural artifacts, were able to permeate these barriers on the digital space and contribute to local content about African culture, about Kenyan culture, or whatever the case may be, is also something that we should be positive about. Lastly, on not being the food on the table, I liked that analogy, Winnie. Again, even as much as the situation's doom and gloom, we must recognize that there's some efforts on the continent that are trying to push back on this increased power imbalance online. A lot of African countries have digitalization strategies that are quite commendable, that have been developed in consultative processes, and in some cases allocate a number of resources to building Africa's digital infrastructure, digitalizing services, including in the AI sector. I think countries like South Africa, Nigeria, and Rwanda have made commendable steps in terms of developing AI strategies that can help inform government interventions and resource allocations in this new age. We should all be aware of that and conversant with those strategies and able to contribute to their domestication and implementation in meaningful ways, as opposed to thinking that, you know, it's all negative developments. So I think that's it from me in terms of reactions from the floor.
I can try answer Winnie's question as well. Had you written it, Aisha? I want to answer it correctly.
Winnie's question. She said, "Can we put our money where our mouth is?" To summarize, that's what I caught in her question.
Okay. Yeah. In line with the protest that happened a few months ago in Kenya, I would say, if anything, the protests have proven that a great percentage of Kenya have a strong sense of community support, because there was a lot of crowdfunding when it came to bailing protesters out of jail, those who had been unlawfully arrested, legal fees when it came to hospital bills. Kenyans were able to come together, contribute so much money, and there was a lot of accountability around it. So if anything, the protest proved that Kenyans have a really strong sense of community support in regarding to crowdfunding and putting together money to push forward an initiative or an agenda. So I will say this as I finish. I will say it doesn't matter how much money, it doesn't matter how much money we crowdfund. It doesn't matter how much. That was a good question, but I'll say this: it doesn't matter how much money we contribute if there are no policies in place that protect the interests of Africans or Kenyans. If there are no policies in place that protect the rights of activists, that protect the rights of Kenyans, that protect even the Constitution, then our efforts as activists or our efforts as Kenyans to look for a better future, our efforts will yield no result. Because in the long run, we need good policies in place, policies that favor every citizen. We need good policies. We need good laws. We need a government that listens. Because the things that Kenyans were championing for in the protests were basic things that are the right of every Kenyan. And currently, Kenya's economy is crippling. And one of the huge factors for the same is persistent, rampant, and remorseless corruption that's going on in the government. And if this is something that's going to continue to happen now and in the foreseeable future, and also in future, then the results we get from activism, unfortunately, will be so little. So if we direct our energy, our time and effort in fighting for good policies and good laws to be in place to protect our rights and to protect our future, and also, and basically to protect our future as Kenyans and also as Africans, then that's a good place to start. Yeah.
Thank you, Mike, Ashna, and Mamudu for responding to those questions. So we are now going to the last round of questions, and after that, I'll open the floor again for the participants. We only have 25 minutes to go, so I will ask my panelists to go straight to the point so we can have time for another round of questions. I will begin with Mamadou, and I believe this question will at the same time address the comment that Raymond added in the Q&A part of the webinar, the virtual session. Mamadou, are there particular technologies or approaches that show promise in supporting digital sovereignty and transparency for African countries?
Yes, Aisha, I hear you. I did not know if I should respond to English or French. I would like to use French. There is a translator also.
Yes, there's interpretation. The issue, I think, is solved. You can speak in French.
Si j'ai bien compris ta question, tu voulais des solutions technologiques concernant la protection des données personnelles.
Non, en fait, ma question, c'est actuellement, est-ce qu'il y a des approches ou des outils prometteurs qui permettraient en fait de soutenir la souveraineté numérique des pays africains en même temps que la transparence?
OK. Donc, parler de souveraineté numérique, je pense que ça rejoint toujours la question de tout à l'heure. Ça veut dire qu'aujourd'hui, nos données qui ne sont pas dans nos serveurs, le fait d'utiliser des serveurs cloud qui ne sont pas en Afrique ou qu'on n'ait pas le contrôle de ces serveurs qui ne sont pas en Afrique, ça amène à se poser beaucoup de questions. Et la souveraineté, elle devrait aller sur beaucoup d'étapes. Une de ces étapes, c'est l'infrastructure. Ça veut dire aujourd'hui, nous, Africains, avoir notre propre infrastructure. Si ceci n'est pas possible, c'est avoir le contrôle de l'infrastructure tierce ou qu'on nous propose. Si ceci n'est pas possible, avoir le contrôle de nos données dans cette infrastructure. Des solutions technologiques existent. Elles permettent à nos États ou d'autres qui le désirent de vouloir l'utiliser. Mais très souvent, la réalité, elle est autre. La réalité, c'est que nos États font confiance à des États étrangers qui ont des intérêts différents de nos États pour leur accompagner dans leur stratégie, dans la conception et dans l'utilisation des outils technologiques. Par exemple, vous avez quelques États qui vont faire appel, comme le Sénégal, par exemple, pour l'état civil du Sénégal. Le Sénégal a un financement de l'Union européenne pour refaire son état civil, le digitaliser. En plus d'avoir ce financement, le Sénégal a une entreprise belge qui a gagné ce marché pour faire ce travail. Et ainsi de suite, ainsi de suite. Ça veut dire qu'il y a aucun moment, l'État du Sénégal a le contrôle total sur ce projet, ce qui ne lui donne pas une souveraineté numérique pour cette problématique-là posée. Et je pense que ce n'est pas le problème seul du Sénégal, c'est le problème de beaucoup de pays africains.
On t'entend plus. Allô?
Déjà,
Allô?
qu'on soit
Allô?
conscient de cette problématique, oui, les États l'aident, mais les États doivent comprendre. Allô, oui? Est-ce que c'est bon?
Oui,
Allô,
c'est
allô?
bon maintenant. On t'entend.
D'accord. Donc, pour ne pas tirer, je pense que pour faire simple encore, la souveraineté ne peut passer que par le contrôle de l'infrastructure, de nos données, de nos applications. Sinon, nous courons à notre perte, pour faire simple.
Thank you, Mamadou, for that important contribution. I will ask you if you have tools that you want to recommend to participants or someone like Raymond of, tools that are already being used or exist, like Zoom developed by Africans. You can share those links, or if there is a platform on GitHub, an account that has more information, you can share that on the chat so that the participants can go and explore on their own. So now I will go to Ashna. And Ashna, my question actually is your experience. In your experience promoting ICT in democratic processes, what do you consider the biggest missed opportunity in digital democracy on the continent?
Thanks, Aisha. Earlier, when I was responding to the comments from the floor, I highlighted a lot of embrace opportunities positively. Building on from that, in terms of missed opportunities, I think there's room for a lot more collaboration among stakeholder groups. When Mike Aroni and the cases from Kenya were being mentioned, that, highlighted the legal fraternity being part of the strategic litigation in the recent challenges in Kenya, medics being supportive and being communities of care. A lot more of that needs to be seen across the continent. In the beginning, when I was highlighting how policymakers and other stakeholders can be levers for more transparency and accountability, collaboration is one of them. Each and every one of us in our very different stakeholder groups need to more proactively engage other stakeholder groups to be part of the wider movement for digital democracy in Africa. So collaborations across academia, across the legal fraternity, more media and civil society engagements, innovators and techies being present in human rights discourse as today is also important. So they too have an understanding of what it means to be a rights-respecting innovator, or if they're working to develop policies internally, or those that are part of their innovation and tech developments, that they also uphold the principles of data protection and privacy, that they also uphold the principles of access to information. So that's critical. Secondly is more multi-stakeholder engagement. Forums like this, in as much as there are few and far between, in as much as there are significant barriers, for instance, for African participation in forums that are hosted outside of the continent, it's still a very critical opportunity and platform to learn and exchange from each other, in as much as we're describing the continent as a whole. Sharing experiences between what happened in Senegal in February and what happened in Kenya more recently will help all of us be able to contextualize what the challenges and opportunities are, because they're absolutely not the same. In as much as the characteristics are the same, there were network disruptions in both cases, there were pushback against the work of activists in both cases, there's still contextual differences between the two. And those are just Senegal and Kenya. Imagine for the other 50 odd countries on the continent. So more stakeholder engagement and opportunities are critical. I think the other opportunity, or one that could be maximized, is around domestication of frameworks. Understandably, in the beginning, I mentioned that a number of the various frameworks that are in place in the digital ecosystem are emerging from the West. That said, there are a few that are emerging off the continent. There's AU frameworks on AI, there's AU frameworks on data protection. There is a whole host of other solutions, including on surveillance and network disruptions. Advocacy by civil society should highlight state obligations and commitments under those frameworks and push for domestication and implementation of the same. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel in terms of the government should do X, Y, and Z. These states and governments have already made commitments as part of the Africa Commission of Human and People's Rights, as part of the African Union. So engagement and advocacy can leverage those instruments and frameworks to promote accountability and transparency by the state, but also by the various platforms and tech developers.
Thank you so much, Ashna. Those are very, very important and powerful points that you've raised. There is need for further collaboration on the different stakeholders, and they also, as you said, need to domesticate frameworks, the existing one, and the need to actually be able to adapt and adopt and localize these policies and frameworks. So I'll go to Mike, and Mike, I want you to just talk about what could be strategies that activists can use to protect citizen voices in spaces increasingly monitored by both governments and tech companies. We know that we have an ongoing shrinking digital civic space on the continent. So if you can briefly touch on that, so that we can take the last questions, because it's 1:16 GMT, so we should be stopping at 1:30, and we want to have another round of questions from participants. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think number one, as activists who are now aware of how these digital platforms can be manipulated to work against us, I think there is need for us to encourage the use of end-to-end encrypted messaging apps like Signal or Telegram. This is something that was happening a few months ago, because they were the safe communication channels then during the protests. I also think there's also need to build a culture of offline community engagement. Not just, I talked of Kenya having two forms of activism. There's the digital activism, which mostly happens on X. We have TikTok, which is now taking a very political shift in Kenya. We also have Instagram. And now we have another form of activism in Kenya, which is on ground activism. And I think that's where we need to concentrate. We also need to give it some kind of attention and concentration by building a culture of offline community engagement, because these digital spaces are important, but face-to-face gatherings and offline networks are also essential they are essential in fueling a message or an agenda in this era of digital surveillance. And probably the last thing I would say is also demanding for transparency and accountabilities from tech companies. During the protests in Kenya, we saw that there was a lot of censorship around the hashtags. Hashtag reject the finance bill 2024. There was also another hashtag that was being censored. For example, on a platform like X, millions and millions of Kenyans are tweeting the same hashtag, but this hashtag is not trending, and everyone just knows it's being censored. So then Kenyans started demanding for transparency and accountability from the X owner, Elon Musk. And believe you me, a few days after, or even a few hours, we started seeing these hashtags trending. So actively demanding for transparency and accountability from these tech companies would also help in the movement. And the last one I would say is building alliances, global or regional or local alliances, to basically amplify our voices as Africans within Africa, building these alliances within Africa, within Kenya, to amplify our voices and to really get our messages out there. That's all I can say.
Thank you, Mike. Now I'll open the floor for questions. We don't have many minutes left. There is a question from Amani Assouman. Amani Assouman, vous pouvez ouvrir votre micro et poser la question que vous avez. Amani Assouman, Aziza, if you can kindly help with that, so that Amani Assouman can open his mic and then ask his question. If you want to ask a question or make a contribution, kindly raise your hand and we'll be able to see and give you the floor. Amani Assouman, vous avez la parole, s'il vous plaît, allez-y.
Oui, bonjour. Vous m'entendez?
Oui, on vous entend très bien. Bonjour.
Bon, bonjour. Donc, je suis au Niger. Je suis un défenseur des droits humains du Niger. Effectivement, en tout cas, je suis très au parfum de tout ce qui se passe par rapport à en tout cas, les organisateurs de cette série d'activités. Et je pense que ça touche du doigt le problème qui se pose avec Acuité en Afrique, quoi. Aujourd'hui, c'est un thème, le colonialisme, en tout cas sur le plan digital, je pense que c'est toujours d'actualité et c'est au cœur même du développement aujourd'hui en Afrique. Qu'est-ce que je dois dire par là? Je voudrais dire que tout simplement, permettez-moi de faire un petit commentaire avant de poser ma question. Je voudrais dire, voyez-vous, l'Afrique n'a pas le même niveau de développement que les autres continents. Notamment, donc, quand vous parlez aujourd'hui de l'intelligence artificielle, je pense que quelque chose qui est assez méconnu, qui n'est pas connu, surtout ici à Niamey, chez nous au Niger, où la pénétration, ou disons le taux de pénétration au niveau de l'Internet est très minime. C'est dérisoire par rapport à ça. Donc, le milieu rural, il y a vraiment une sorte de fracture numérique. Donc, je pense qu'il y a des préalables, qu'il faille combler. Il y a des choses, on doit aller, en tout cas, mollo, comme on dit, doucement, tout doucement. Et en quoi faisant, en misant sur la qualité. Aujourd'hui, est-ce qu'on ne ferait pas nécessaire à partir du collège, à partir du secondaire, il ne serait pas nécessaire peut-être d'inculquer en tout cas, ça ne se décrète pas, j'allais dire, ça ne se décrète pas. Ça, c'est pas un beau matin par coup de baguette magique qu'on peut arriver là où, chose quoi, relativement à cette thématique-là. Je pense qu'il y a un travail préalable à faire, quel que soit, en tout cas, c'est pour cela qu'il faut miser sur les ONG. Malheureusement, nous sommes dépourvus de moyens. C'est pas pour faire un plaidoyer, mais je peux dire que quelque part, il faut que nous soyons outillés nous-mêmes, il faut que nous soyons, on ratisse large. Est-ce qu'il ne serait pas nécessaire d'avoir des points focaux dans ces différents pays-là? Vous voyez que de prendre le haut, un beau matin, vous prenez le haut pour pouvoir descendre vers le. Vous voyez, c'est difficile. Il faut construire, il faut prendre en tout cas, il faut mettre des sous-bassements, il faut qu'il y ait les fondamentaux de ce domaine et bien d'autres, hein, notamment par rapport à la démocratie libérale, avec beaucoup de choses. Vous voyez, aujourd'hui au Niger, au Niger et dans la sous-région au Sahel, il y a un certain nombre de pays, nous sommes sous des régimes militaires, mais il y a une sorte d'adhésion populaire. Vous voyez, quelque part, c'est parce que la démocratie classique, là, je ne suis pas pour défendre les coups d'État, mais c'est pour dire que la démocratie, telle que nous l'avons calquée, copie, conception conforme à l'original à partir de l'Occident, ça pose problème chez nous, en tout cas dans nos pays sous nos tropiques, en tout cas notamment au Sahel. Aujourd'hui, les populations au Sahel adhèrent en tout cas à ce que font les coups d'État, parce que la démocratie libérale a échoué. On a vu les acteurs. Au lieu de travailler pour le peuple, la démocratie, c'est seulement, permettez-moi de le dire, c'est seulement, j'ai fait ce panel-là au niveau à Arusha, lors de l'African Drive for Democracy, il y a 2 ans de cela. J'ai fait ce panel-là.
Oui. Vous pouvez résumer, s'il vous plaît, nous sommes à
donc,
quelques
vraiment,
minutes.
permettez-moi, Aïcha, merci beaucoup. Donc, merci. Donc, vraiment, pour couper court, j'espère que mon message a été entendu pour dire que nous devons travailler et qu'est-ce qu'on doit faire. Maintenant, les spécialistes sont là en tant que panélistes. Qu'est-ce que nous devons faire pour que, en tout cas, la manœuvre prenne, pour qu'aujourd'hui, pour que il y a une fracture. Qu'est-ce que nous devons faire pour que numérique, qu'est-ce que nous devons faire pour que l'intelligence artificielle soit une réalité, pour que ça ne soit pas à la traîne par rapport à, en tout cas, parce que c'est admis qu'il y a le colonialisme à ce niveau-là. Donc, qu'est-ce que nous devons faire pour pouvoir être au même diapason, pour être, à défaut de rattraper les puissances occidentales, pour que nous puissions nous servir pour l'avancée de la démocratie sur notre pays. Voilà ce que je voulais dire, madame. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Amani Asumani from Niger. We know that it's not easy in countries of the core Sahel, that's Mali, Burkina, and Niger, going through a military rule. We are with you as Africans, and I would just want to give the floor to the panelists to respond and also for their closing remarks, because we just have 6 minutes left. If each can just use 3 minutes, that actually I'll be very happy, so I can conclude and thank all the organizers of this panel, and thank you to Raymond, who continues to contribute and share. He has shared a link, a YouTube link, so you can open and see what he is talking about. Thank you for the engagement. So I give the floor to Mamadou to respond and also give his closing remarks, then to Ashna.
Merci Aïcha. Merci encore pour l'opportunité de pouvoir partager avec ce panel qui est riche. Donc, aujourd'hui, la technologie nous réunit. C'est grâce à elle qu'on a cette opportunité de pouvoir dialoguer, de pouvoir faire ce Zoom. Donc, des éléments de réflexion qui ont été émis ici à nous détacher de cette emprise que nous avons, de ce colonialisme que nous subissons depuis des années et qui continue comme nous le dit le monsieur du Niger, il faut faire quelque chose. Qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire? Tout simplement, je lui dis que nous sommes en train de travailler depuis des années, nous tous sommes en train, chacun de son coin, en train d'y travailler. Le fait de réunir nos efforts et le fait d'aller sur un plaidoyer commun nous aide à aller de l'avant. Et important qu'il a travaillé avec le terrain, mais il ne suffit pas. L'avenir de l'Afrique, ça veut dire les jeunes, pour qu'ils puissent être mieux armés en technologie, en sciences, en informatique, en tout ce qu'il leur faut comme outil pour réussir les challenges de demain. L'un des challenges de demain, c'est le contrôle de nos données. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, qu'on le veuille ou non, c'est le méta Google rôle du monde et que si nous, Africains, nous ne devons pas être en reste, nous devons voir comment avoir un meilleur contrôle de nos données. Merci encore.
Merci beaucoup, Geno. Ashna, you have the floor. It seems Ashna, you're here?
Yes, apologies. I was still listening to the translation.
Oh, sorry.
So parting shots, overall, I think engagements such as this are really important in terms of putting forward recommendations and ideas on how to democratize tech, democratize governance, and ensure sovereignty of digitalization on the continent is upheld. Of course, a lot of the discourse here and in many other spaces is focused on AI and innovation and future of work and activism, all of these very new forms of tech's impact on society. The only thing I would like to emphasize is that these discussions must not lose sight of some of the founding pillars of democratization of tech, that is access, affordability, and inclusion. We cannot have discussions about AI, about innovation, about the future of work, about activism and grassroots movement building using tech without confronting the fact that the internet and related technologies are still unaffordable to a huge number of citizens on the continent. The infrastructure is still not extending to some of the more rural and remote parts of the continent. And that even where access and affordability have been overcome, it's not necessarily inclusive. It doesn't account for communities such as those living in rural areas, women, persons with disability, migrant communities, etc. So the conversation and the lenses must be broad enough to ensure that those founding pillars around access, affordability, and inclusion are really what upholds the digital democracy or the democratization of tech that we want to see going forward.
Thank you, Ashna. Mike, you have the floor, your closing remarks. In 2 minutes, please, if you're still with us.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay.
Thank you so much for having me. And I agree with Ashna. Programs like this, initiatives like this should happen on a regular and on a bigger scale to get to many more people. My parting shot is I see a really bright future, not just for Kenya, but also for Africa. And I am saying this because I am so glad and excited that the civic awareness among Africans has finally been awakened. And and not just Africans, especially among the youth, because we are starting to see over the past few months, we've seen most of the protests in African countries have mostly been youth-led, and they've mostly been digitally led, and they've also translated to being now on ground protests. And these are basically channels for the youth to really demand for accountability, and the youth are now taking control, and they're now actively demanding for accountability and doing things that were not being previously done in an attempt to regain power and to have power back to the people, back to the citizens. So I see a bright future, and I'm glad I was part of this conversation. And if anything in future, if something similar happens in future, I would be glad to be part of it. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for the organizers for having me, and have a good day. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all our panelists who actually have given great recommendations, some that can be implemented now, others that need to be worked on, you know, to be able to have a more balanced digital space at global level, but specifically for the continent. I would want to thank the organizers. You have Power 254, Affectivist, the Center for Strategic Litigation, Wademos, the Johns Hopkins Institute, specifically the Agora Institute, the D-Hub, Akina Mamawa Africa, Ford Foundation, Irene Stankin Foundation, Agora, Rivoria Circle, for organizing these actually virtual sessions that will lead to the Indaba in November in South Africa. The hashtag is D4D2024. Kindly continue engaging us there. And we stand in solidarity with Mozambique, DR Congo, Sudan, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Kenya. We continue to work together to build the Africa we want, for unity and for prosperity for our people. Thank you for being with us today. Thanks to the participants, and their contribution and questions actually have enriched this discussion. I am Aisha Dabo, Program Coordinator, Activist, and I was the moderator of this panel. Thank you all, and see you next on November 4th, actually, for the last virtual sessions of the Drive for Democracy with the hashtag D4D2024. Thank you, and thanks to the interpreter actually for the great work you've done facilitating the communication. Bye.